So leaving off from the last section, there are 3 stages of the read technique, and specifically in step 1, interrogators start with direct positive confrontation of the suspect. And like I iterated in the last section, the interrogation begins long before the suspect enters the police station or custody, in various different ways, but I gave the example of being in a room that have boxes that look like evidence with your name written on them, or just sitting in a room for long periods of time, kind of like adding to this the stress of sitting there and wondering why you are there. Once the detective enters the room, though, they present the facts of the case and they inform the suspect of the evidence against him or her. This evidence might be real or it might be made up, which we have labeled as false evidence ploys. And I'll get more into that in the confessions lecture. But the detective typically states in a confident manner that the suspect is involved in the crime, that they know that they did it, and then the suspect's stress level starts increasing, and the interrogator may move around the room and invade the suspect's personal space to increase the discomfort without ever touching them, because that would render a confession inadmissible. But they pause, they observe, and then they repeat this confrontation in step 1, and then if they get a passive reaction, they typically believe that this is deception. And then they handle suspects differently depending on how they react to this direct positive confrontation. So the read technique says that there are 2 kinds of suspects, and how interrogators decide to proceed depends on the type of suspect. Generally, Reed says there are 2 types that are considered emotional and non-emotional. If the suspect appears to feel distressed, the interrogator should approach with sympathy and appeal to their conscience. So, don't you just want to don't you just want to confess and do the right thing? Wouldn't you want the victim's family to have closure? You're not a bad guy. You just made a mistake. So if they're emotional, they're assuming that this person is remorseful in some way, and so they're trying to appeal to their conscience by bringing up the victim's family or other things, maybe their own family. But they are assuming that they have some emotion about the incident, and so they're going to try to pull on their heartstrings to get them to confess. However, if the suspect appears to feel nothing and is calm, so the suspect feels nothing particularly, then the interrogator should approach with a factual analysis. So they start by specifically just laying out the facts and demonstrating that they are faulty, that their version of the truth isn't real, and they know that, or at least that the way the suspect presents them is inaccurate. So the investigators are told to appeal to non-emotional suspects using reasoning and common sense. So one example, come on, Jimmy, we know you did it. We have your shoe prints, an eyewitness, and we know your alibi is crap. It's obvious that you killed her. So just tell us so we don't have to waste your time or my time. So depending on what kind of response they get from suspects will kind of determine how they're going to continue on during the interrogation. And they build on this some more. So in step 2, the read technique says to create a theme. The interrogator creates a story about why the suspect committed the crime. Theme development is about looking through the eyes of the suspect to figure out why he did it, why he'd like to think he did it, and what type of excuse might make him admit he did it. Does the suspect use any particular mode of reasoning more often than others? And so, for example, does the suspect seem willing to blame the victim? The detective might lay out this theme, a story that the suspect can latch onto. And so in an emotional suspect theme, you might see that investigators normalize the situation. Oh, well, anybody would have acted that way, obviously. I would have also killed my wife if I found her cheating on me. That's a normal situation. You didn't act abnormally. And you can also minimize the crime's moral seriousness to kind of go back to this example of killing your wife. If you found them cheating on you, yeah, I'd do that too. Like, it's not that big of a deal. Um, they can also suggest morally acceptable reasons why they may have done it. We know you're not selling drugs because you have a drug problem or that you want to add to the drug problem. You're selling drugs because you have to pay for diapers. I get it. Like, jobs are hard to come by and you're just doing what you can, right? So that's one way they can kind of make something more morally acceptable. And then there's the theme of condemning others. So with emotional suspects, you might say, well, she egged you on. She dressed that way, or she gave you this information. So you did what was natural to you, what anybody else would have done. And then they might even give praise and flattery. Oh, you killed the guy. Good. He was no good. We know about him. I wish that I could have done it. So they're praising and flattering the suspect for the crime that they committed. They might also say, well, your role has just been exaggerated. Like, we know that you didn't actually plan this, and that Frank over here told you that you had to do it, and so just tell us what your role was. We know that you're not like really the person at fault. It's not really your fault. You were just doing what you thought you had to do. You were going along with your friend, whatever. The suspect's role just is exaggerated. So these are the themes that might go along with an emotional suspect that Reed and Associates suggest using. Now, with a non-emotional suspect theme development is kind of different. So for this person, you might try to catch them in a lie because we're trying to work on logic here instead of their emotions. So you try to get them to say something that just doesn't add up with the rest of what they said, so you can catch them in a lie, and get the suspect associated with the crime scene. So you walk them through it and you just tell them like, oh, like, this is what we know, here are the facts, and kind of like putting them in the place and getting them to talk about it, trying to get them to talk about this place. And then they often say there's no point in denying involvement. We know, like going back to this reason and logic. We have your fingerprints, we have this. There's no fighting it. So just tell us the truth. They might also play one co-offender off the other if they have the option here. They just think that, again, this adds to this like logic and reasoning of someone who's non-emotional. And so during this whole time, during step 2 in creating a theme, the interrogator is usually speaking in a soft, soothing voice to kind of come across as non-threatening and to lull the suspect into a false sense of security. So they're just trying to get the suspect to think that they can talk, that they're not on the defensive right now. And you'll see in a lot of the themes for the emotional suspect that matches more synonymously. So in step 3 of the Reed technique, interrogators do not allow denials. So letting the suspect deny his guilt will increase his confidence. So the detective tries to interrupt all denials, sometimes telling the suspect that it'll be his turn to talk in a moment, but right now he needs to listen. And from the start of the interrogation, the detective watches for denials and stops the suspect before he can voice them. In addition to keeping the suspect's confidence low, stopping denials also helps quiet the suspect so he doesn't have a chance to ask for a lawyer. And if there are no denials during theme development, the detective might take this as a positive indicator of guilt. So they're shutting up to protect themselves from any more issues that might result in detecting their guilt. If an initial attempts at denial slow down or stop during theme development, the interrogator knows that they have found a good theme and that the suspect is getting closer to confessing. So during this time, it's if someone says, well, I didn't do it, the interrogator just continually just says, nope, I don't want to hear it. It's not your turn to talk. I'm talking. I know you did it. I know you did it. And just continually interrupts them and kind of gets inside their head in that way. During this step in the interrogation, investigators believe that innocent and guilty people will behave differently, so they look for signs of this. Specifically, they believe that innocent suspects will react to denial interruptions spontaneously, forcefully, directly, with eye contact and assertive posture of leaning forward in their chair. So they're more kind of like in your face, like, no, I didn't do it. That's what the interrogators believe innocent suspects will do. And then conversely, they believe that guilty suspects are thought to be kind of the opposite. So hesitant and defensive and qualified or limited in their responses. So they're not saying much. They're just trying to kind of like hold back so that they're not caught in a lie. But again, the interrogator doesn't allow any denials. You're not allowed to deny anything. We know you did it. But once the interrogator has fully developed a theme that the suspect can relate to, the suspect might offer a logic-based objections as opposed to simple denials, because their simple denials of being involved aren't getting through because the interrogator has continually interrupted those denials. And so now, instead of these simple denials, they might say things like, I could never rape somebody. My sister was raped and I saw how much pain it caused. I would never do that to someone. And then the detective handles these types of objections differently than those of just denial, because these objections can give information to turn around and use against the suspect. So the interrogator might say something like, see, that's good. You're telling me you would never plan this, that it was out of your control. You care about women like your sister. It was just a one-time mistake, not a reoccurring thing. So the interrogator can flip some of that information around and kind of use it as a weapon against the suspect. If the detective does their job right in this step, an objection ends up looking more like an admission of guilt. Now, in step 4 and 5, at this point, the suspect should be frustrated and unsure of themselves. So he might be looking for someone to help him escape the situation. So the interrogator tries to capitalize on that insecurity by pretending to be the suspect's ally. Look, dude, you can get out of this situation if you just tell us what happened, if you just tell us why you did it. And so the interrogator will try to appear even more sincere in this continued theme development, and the interrogator might get physically closer to the suspect to make it harder for the suspect to detach from the situation. So the interrogator may offer physical gestures of camaraderie and concern, such as touching the suspect's shoulder or patting his back. Many interrogations last many hours, so suspects kind of start falling apart psychologically. They just become mainly frustrated, but also fatigued. So interrogators can't have some way to handle this. So in step 6 of the read technique, they're told to handle passiveness. So if the suspect's body language indicates surrender, so maybe he has his head in his hands, his elbows on his knees, his shoulders are hunched, the interrogator sees the opportunity to start leading the suspect into confession because they believe that the suspect is likely about to give in. So they're really honing down on this central theme and focusing on what they've been going through the entire interrogation. So the interrogator will start transitioning from theme development to motive alternatives, which I'll get into in the next step, that force the suspect to choose a reason why he or she committed the crime. Some of the biggest indicators that people are kind of checking out and trying to become passive is that they are crying. They're sobbing is this person, I can't remember the name of the show off the top of my head right now, but they're sobbing. People who are sobbing are kind of checked out. You don't want that. Or you want that because they're ready to confess, but you're trying to keep them engaged with you. The other thing that they might do is, as Kevin Hart is doing, is give this blank stare. So now the interrogator believes they're ready to confess. This person's ready to get out of that room. So during this time, the interrogator will speak in a soft, soothing voice to appear non-threatening and lull the suspect into a false sense of security. So they're continuing to handle this passiveness, and they're trying to guide them towards a confession. So in step 7, the interrogator provides 2 options, with neither of them being denial of the crime. So this is a form of alternative questioning. So they present 2 options. They present a best case or worst case scenario. One example would be, would you prefer coffee or tea? You don't get the option, or you don't see the option as clearly that you don't have to have either of those things. Maybe you could have water or you could have nothing. But the question is, would you prefer coffee or tea? And specifically for this instance, one example could be like, did you take the money because you were out of baby formula or because you wanted to buy more cocaine? You might gain sympathy if you just tell us your story, just tell us why you did it. If you're not a bad guy, you had a screaming baby at home and you needed to feed her. It's not your fault that you were laid off from your job. So best case, worst case, are you a bad guy or are you a good dad? What are you? This is considered to be the most important part of the read technique. At this point, the interrogator has broken the suspect down. They're scared, they're isolated, they're exhausted, and they want nothing more than to leave the custody of the officers. The hope is that they will take the bait and say, no, I didn't steal the money because I needed more cocaine. I stole the money to help my kid. But again, because they're so worn down by anxiety, someone might have a slip of the tongue and make a statement that is pretty damning to their guilt. Then, once the suspect chooses an alternative, the confession has started. So the person's already hung themselves. They're starting down this path of guilt. The interrogator encourages the suspect to talk about the crime and arranges for at least 2 people to witness the confession. Or in many states now, they do video confessions. One person might be the second detective in a room, and another may be brought in for the purpose of forcing the suspect to confess to a new detective. Having to confess to a new person increases the suspect's stress level and their desire to just sign a statement and get out of there. So now you have 3 people in this tiny room, and you just need to get out of here. So let's get it over with. Bringing a new person into the room also forces the suspect to reassert his socially acceptable reason for the crime, reinforcing the idea that the confession is a done deal. So if they took the lesser evil of the alternative questions in the cocaine or diaper example, they are now they feel more inclined to present this socially acceptable reason for doing what they did to this new person. Moving on, in step 9, which is the final stage of the interrogation, is all about getting the confession admitted at trial. The interrogator will have to have the suspect write out his or her confession or state it on videotape, probably both. The suspect is usually willing to do anything at this point to escape the interrogation, and the suspect confirms that his confession is voluntary, it's not coerced, and signs the statement in front of witnesses. So this is all in court. We want the jury to believe that this person decided to do this on their own volition, and having a written confession is just more damning than saying that I did it. The jury can read it. It's pretty solid evidence. It should be noted here that if at any point during the interrogation the suspect does somehow manage to ask for a lawyer or invoke his or her right to silence, the interrogation has to stop immediately. That's why it's so important to interrupt the suspect's attempts to speak in the initial stages. If they do invoke their rights, the interrogation is over. And to be clear, there are some nuances in this, in how the laws are determined. So saying maybe I should get a lawyer isn't enough. The suspect has to say, get me a lawyer now. Not I want a lawyer because I want, and give me an attorney is different. So this language is kind of problematic, but the interrogators are trying to keep the suspect from getting an attorney because at that point the interrogation's over. The attorney is not going to let that person talk. So the whole point of the Reed model of interrogation is that the psychology behind this technique is to make the anxiety associated with not confessing to the crime greater than the anxiety related to the consequences of confessing. The Reed technique wants the suspect to feel like they have to leave the room, and to be able to leave the room, they need to confess. Explicitly, they're not trying to get people to confess to crimes they didn't commit. They do believe wholeheartedly in this model, and that it's getting guilty people to confess to crimes and innocent people to not confess to crimes. So it's not to paint the creators in this terrible light, but the Reed model of interrogation, as we'll learn in the next lecture, is very problematic, and is more likely to induce false confessions as well. So although guilty people do confess more under the Reed model, so do innocent people, and the best thing that we could do is have people who are not factually guilty not go to jail.